بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Everyone, hope you can hear me, inshallah. So we're going to go through ma'ani, wal-ma'ani an-naqizatu lil-wudu'i. So we're going to go through things that nullify or break one's wudu. And some of you who've done a little bit of advanced fiqh with me will already know that we've gone through some of the rational reasons as to why some of these things which break wuzu actually make sense. But we're not going to go through that in this text because, of course, what I want to do is just go through the masail for now. And at an advanced level, inshallah, if Allah wills, we can go through how the Hanafi fuqaha had certain ideas when they were discussing fiqh. One of them was they wanted to stick to the literal meaning of the Quran as much as possible because that had epistemic certainty. So the more close you were aligned to the literal word of Allah, the stronger basis you had for your position. Number two was that they tried to look at practice. So this is where they differentiate themselves, or they are differentiated from uh, people who take hadith as a position in of itself, right? They also look at the practice of the Prophet, of course, alayhi salatu salam, but also of the companions. So practice of the early Muslim community was also important. And there are other things as well. And they also looked at how the Quran Sunnah, but they also looked at how these things made sense as well. So first of all, I'm just going to read the Arabic, and then I'm going to translate it briefly and then explain it, inshallah. So he says, وَالْمَعَانِ النَّاقِذَةُ لِلْوُضُوء. Right? The meanings of the things that break naqiza, that it comes from the word naqada, which makes it basically means deficient, right? Sorry, it comes from a word that's similar. Naqiz basically means something that's break, and naqasa with a sword on would be something that's deficient. So the meaning here is that something is broken, right? Things that nullify one's wuzu, if you like. So Imam Quduri will go through seven things, and I'll go through the seven things with you. So first of all, he says the first one, kullu, everything, ma kharaja, that leaves, that exits, if you like. Kullu ma kharaja min as-sabilain, from the two passages, right? That's the first one. Kullu ma kharaja min as-sabilain, everything that exits, this is a verb, from the two passageways, if you like, as well. And I'll go through those in a moment. The next one he talks about, next category, if you like, wadamu, blood, wal-qayh, which is pus, and was-sadid, serum, right? So these are three things that he mentions as well: blood, pus, and serum. Okay, and then he kind of makes he says, okay, so he's mentioned about things that leave from the two passageways. Then he's talked about blood, pus, and serum. But then he adds like a sort of a condition to it, saying that it's not blood in of itself. What does it have to do? إذا خرج من البدن. إذا means when it exits, it leaves from the badan. The badan is the body. It leaves the body, right? فتجاوز, and it moves, right? It leaves the body, it exits the body, and it flows. Or it tajawuz basically means to go beyond your limit. Min al had. Tajawuz basically means when someone does tajawuz, they basically go beyond their limit. They go beyond a boundary, for example. So here it basically literally means that it flows, because we're talking about liquids here, right? So it flows. فتجاوز إلى, to where? Where does it flow to? Where does blood flow to? إلى موضع, to a place يلحقه حكم التطهير, a place where it has the ruling of purification, right? So I'm going to go through all of this in a moment, so don't worry. So we have two things already. We've talked about things that exist from two parts of our body. Then the second one is blood, pus, and serum, and then he's described what he means by it, that it has to go, it has to leave the body, it has to exit the body and go to a place where the hukum of purification is normally there. That's fine. That's two so far. We'll come back to all of this again. The third category, if you like, for him is والقي والقي إذا كان ملء الفم. This is the third one. Vomiting when إذا قي means vomiting when it's full mouth, right? Vomiting when it is a mouthful. So that's the third one, if you like. Then, if you like, the next category, and you can put all of these together, one nawmu, right? Mil al fami, one nawmu, sleeping, and he kind of gives three descriptions of sleeping. Mustaji'an, sleeping lying down, mustaji'an, or muttaki'an, which basically means lying down, right? Or reclining rather, right? Reclining on something. And muttaki'an, which basically means leaning on something. So sleeping, when a person is either lying down mustaji'an, and I'll describe this in a moment for you, or when a person is reclining, muttaki'an, or mustanidan, or like he's leaning on something, ila shay'in, right? That in such a way that law uzila, leaning on something in such a way that law uzila anhu, if that thing was to be taken away from him or her, if you like, la saqata, right? That he'd fall down. So that's like the fourth. That's like the fourth one. Okay, just to recap, everything that leaves the body is number one. Blood, pus, and serum is the second one. Vomiting full mouth is the third one. The fourth one is sleeping in these three postures, but the third one in here, he does explain what he means. So that's the fourth one. And then the fifth one here, وَالْغَلَبَةُ عَلَى الْأَقْلِ بِالْإِغْمَاءِ, right? That he has overcome his intellect. Well, as you know, ghalaba means to overcome something, right? Allah mentions the word ghalaba in the Quran. The verb rather is used in the Quran as well. So wal ghalaba means to overcome. In other words, the person's intellect is overcome. He's no longer he's incapacitated, right? Intellectually. Wal ghalabatu ala al-aqli bil igma, and his intellect is overcome bil igma, by fainting. Bil igma means by fainting. He then also mentions another one. That's the fifth one, and then he says wal junoon, which is a state of insanity. It comes from the word, you can see the word jinn coming through as well, but junoon is a form of insanity. So that's the sixth one. And the final one, wal qahqahatu. Qahqaha basically means to laugh aloud, right? To laugh fi kulli salatin, but in which prayer? Laughing in prayer, in every prayer, ذات ركوع وسجود, every prayer that consists of ruku and sujud. So we have seven items, or if you like, 6 items, depending how you count, where one's wudu is broken. So let's go back, inshallah, and just explain them in a little bit more detail, inshallah, for you. All right. Let's go back 1 second, please. Let me just go back. Okay, 1 second. 1 second, please. Okay, so the first one, كل ما خرج من السبيلين, right? The first one that breaks the wuzu. So everything that exits from the sabilain, the two passages. So it's sabilain is, for those of you who study Arabic, that's in a dual form. So everything that exists from the two passages, and that obviously refers to things that come out in the form of urine and feces, right? I.e., the anus and excreting feces, and the urethra, right, where excreting urine takes place as well. So everything that comes out from these places, one's wuzu breaks. One's wuzu is instantly broken, even letting wind out, right, because it's exited. And I'm going to go into some explanation on this in a moment, inshallah. So that's the first thing. The second thing he says that breaks one wuzu is blood, pus, right, and serum. But he says this in of itself doesn't break one's wuzu. It doesn't break one's wuzu. Something has to happen. It has to leave the badan. It has to leave the badan, and it has to go to a place where the hukam of tathir is important. So in other words, what it basically means is that when you start bleeding, it has to flow for your wuzu to break. If you're bleeding and that blood, take an example of blood, doesn't flow, your wuzu doesn't break, right? It has to move from that place to a place to elsewhere where one's wuzu would break, right? So that's very, very important distinction that the Hanafi jurists make as well. And you have to remember that normally, when you are in a state of major impurity, which we'll cover later on, you have to wash the whole body, right? You have to wash the whole body. Because in minor impurity, you don't have to wash the whole body, but it's just the wuzu will break. But the important point to remember here is what you'll notice is that the fuqaha are pointing at something. And we'll cover this in advanced text, but they're pointing at something. Now, what they're saying basically here is that if you think about it, urine or feces or blood or pus, they're in your body, right? They're with you all the time. In your body, they're with you all the time. And so they would you one would say, well, how do you make the distinction in terms of at what stage does your wuzu break? So what they say is that it has to move from its original position. So, for example, urine is in the bladder. So you can't help that. Blood is in your body. You can't help that. But once it moves and it moves to a place, the liquid moves to a place. This is the reason behind it. This is rational behind it. This is the logic behind it. And it goes to a place which is normally pure and it touches that place, your wuzu breaks. So let me give you another example. And forgive me for using this explicit example. But for example, uh, a person's anus, for example, or a person's penis, for example, is not napak in of itself, right? It's not impure in of itself, right? But when a urine leaves and it starts making its way to that part of the body and it exits from that part of the body, then the wuzu breaks. Can you see? Because the urine has moved from the body, inside the body, and it's exited, right? Blood is in the body. In of itself, it's not napak. But when it touches this part of the skin where where it's supposed to be pure, and it touches that part, then the wuzu breaks. Can you see? So the Hanafis are very consistent in this, and they apply this rationale. So anyway, I've gone into a bit more detail. I've digressed, but that's just something to bear in mind. Inshallah, some of you have already studied this with me already before, and you'll understand where I'm taking all of this. But I'm going to resist going into too much detail. But anyway, anything that exists from the front or the back, the two passages, that breaks a wuzu. Blood, pus, serum, when it flows, that breaks one's wuzu as well. All right. The next one is vomiting. Now, vomiting has to be full mouth. So when a person vomits full mouth, then and only then will their wuzu break, right? And so it has to be vomiting in such a way that you're not able to hold it back. It's just full mouth, right? And this makes sense as well. If you kind of reason from what we've done before, this reason that runs through these nawaqis of wuzu, these things that break wuzu, it makes sense as well. Because that food that's in the body or whatever that's in the body has left the stomach and it's gone to the mouth, which is almost exiting. Because the mouth is sort of like in this realm where it's exiting the body. So can you see the Hanafis are super rational, mashallah. And you'll see this if you study advanced texts with me, that it really makes sense. And this is because there's this view that Allah's law also makes sense. It's a divine law, it's a revelation, but it also makes sense. So vomiting full mouth also breaks one wuzu. It has to be إذا كان, as you said here, full mouth. The next one, the fourth one's interesting, sleeping. But sleeping in of itself doesn't break the wuzu. It has to be in one of three states. Mustaji'an, lying down. That's how you would lie down in bed with your pillow and your entire body's lying down on the body, right? You do that, your wuzu breaks if you sleep in that state. Muttaqi'an, reclining. So instead of like, you know, how you're resting on one arm, if you're reclining, then that also would break your wuzu if you go to sleep in that state, reclining state, right? Because what you see here as well, there's a sense of being aware, right? That you have to be aware, you have to be alert. If you're not alert, then you don't know what's happening, right? You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if your wuzu is broken or not. But if you're alert, you know. And you see that in the next masala as well. Or muttaki'an. So I've talked about muttaki, reclining. Or mustanidan ila shay'in. So you're kind of like, I don't know, you're reclining on a tree, right? If you go to sleep reclining on a tree, and if you said to yourself, if this tree was to be moved from behind me, I'd fall over, then your wuzu would break. If you're sitting in a car, traveling, if you're like me, and you sometimes, if you're just a passenger, it's a long journey, you can fall asleep. If that seat was to be moved, you'd fall over, then your wuzu would break because you're no longer alert, right? So that's why he's saying, "Law uzila anhu," if that thing was to be moved from him, la saqata, right? You'd fall over. And so that would break your wuzu as well. But there's this idea in wuzu that you have to be conscious, you have to be alert because you have to know what's going on, right? And you find this idea in the hadith literature as well, that when a person sleeps at night, when he wakes up, he should wash himself and do wuzu and so forth because he doesn't know where his hand has been, for example. So that's the next one. Then he says, وَالْغَلَبَةُ عَلَى الْأَقْلِ بِالْإِغْمَاءِ. So if a person's intellect is overcome with fainting, you can see this idea coming again with the fuqaha, that there's an idea here that she's no longer alert. They don't know if they've got wuzu or not, for sure. And it comes down to this idea I mentioned in other lectures about epistemology. Hanafis don't like uncertainty. Hanafis like certainty. Anything that's certain, they love it. Anything that's uncertain, then they kind of have issues with it. So because you've fainted, you don't even know if you had wuzu or not. You could argue that your wuzu didn't break, you didn't do anything, but they will say, well, we're unsure, so therefore your wuzu breaks as well, amongst many reasons that they would give. Um, the next one is junoon, which is a state of insanity, and that makes sense based on what we said before as well. This idea of not being alert. And the final one here is qahqaha, which is a form of laughing. Now, there's three forms of laughing that the fuqaha usually talk about, and the one qahqaha here is that ma takunu masmu'an lahu walijarihi, laughing in such a way that you hear it and people next to you hear it as well. So it's a laughing out loud. Doing that will break your wuzu, right? There's another form, the second type, which is dhahik, which is a form of laughing. Ma yakunu masmu'an lahu duna jarihi. That will, if you do that in prayer, if you laugh in such a way that only you can hear it, it will break your prayer, but it won't break your wuzu, right? It's a secondary level. And in this tabassum, which is just smiling, smiling doesn't break your fast, neither, doesn't break your wuzu, neither does it break your prayer as well, okay? And we'll talk about the reasons for this maybe some point later on. So these are the things that break one's wuzu according to Imam Khuduri. I'll just go through them one more time. Anything that exists from the two passages, all blood plus pus or serum, such that when they exit from the body, they flow to a place that is subject to rule of purification, which I've talked about in some detail. Vomiting when it's a mouthful, right? Um, the next one is sleeping, when a person is either lying down, reclining, or leaning on something, such that if the item was to be removed, they'd fall over. Then the next one is intellect being overcome. Then the next one is insanity. And the final one is laughing in such a way that a person can hear you and you can hear it yourself. But they do make a condition here, في كل صلاة ذات ركوع ذات ركوع وسجود. Only in those prayers which have ruku' and sujud in them. So which prayers don't have sujud, sijda and ruku'? For example, janazah salah. When you're performing janazah salah, this wouldn't apply in there. So only in those salah that have sijda and ruku' in it, if this was to happen, if a person laughed loud in them, their wuzu would break. I'm going to stop there and stop the recording. And hopefully you found that very, very useful.